Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a plunge into one of the deepest subjects there is, philosophy. We're talking about the really fundamental, mind-bending questions that human beings have been wrestling with for, well, thousands of years.
Yeah, exactly. And to guide us through this, we've pulled together a fantastic stack of source material. It's essentially a lightning tour from the birth of Western philosophy in ancient Greece, across different cultures, right up to some truly cutting-edge ideas shaping how we think today.
Absolutely. Our mission in this deep dive is really to cut through the complexity. We want to unpack the core ideas from these readings, figure out how different thinkers approach the same problems in, wildly different ways, and most importantly, understand why these ancient and maybe not so ancient thoughts can still deliver some powerful aha moments for you right now.
Consider this your shortcut, maybe, to getting well-informed on concepts that underpin centuries of human thought.
So let's dig in. Let's start with the absolute basics. What is philosophy, according to these sources?
Well, according to Plato, it begins with a feeling we all recognize, wonder. He says, "Wonder is very much the affection of a philosopher, for there is no other beginning of philosophy than this. It's that deep curiosity about the world, the universe, ourselves."
That resonates.
Yeah.
It's not just accepting things as they are, but asking why they are that way or, how they work. The sources point out that when those first thinkers popped up in ancient Greece, maybe, 2,500 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
they were explicitly trying to find rational explanations for the world around them, sort of moving away from just myths or traditions.
Right. And they immediately hit upon the biggest questions. What actually exists? What is the nature of reality? And how can we possibly know anything, for sure? That last one, the question of how we acquire knowledge, is a huge branch of philosophy called epistemology.
The sources also highlight other major areas. There's logic, which is essentially the study of correct reasoning. How do you build a valid argument? It's kind of the foundation for things like science and mathematics.
Exactly. And many philosophers have been fascinated by the certainty you get from mathematical truths and tried to find that same kind of certainty in philosophical reasoning.
Then you have ethics or moral philosophy. This is where we grapple with concepts like, what is a good life?
Hmm.
What do justice or happiness really mean? How should we behave?
Uh-huh. And aesthetics, the study of beauty and art, though that comes into focus a bit more later on.
So it's this massive field, but the sources make a point of saying it's often not about finding one definitive answer.
Precisely. It's described less as like a body of knowledge and more as a way of thinking. A rigorous, systematic way to approach these fundamental questions, even when maybe there are no right or wrong answers.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's rewind all the way back to ancient Greece, the cradle of Western philosophy.
Right. This is where we see that explicit shift from mythological thinking to seeking rational explanations.
And the earliest guys were surprisingly, literal in their curiosity about the world's building blocks. Like Thales of Miletus, who looked around and asked, what is the basic material of the cosmos? He landed on water, thinking, it was essential for life. It could move, it changes form. It seemed fundamental.
It seems simple now, perhaps, but that was a huge step, looking for a single natural substance as the source of everything. This idea that everything is basically one thing is called monism. Others followed, suggesting different elements like Empedocles with earth, air, fire, and water.
And then Pythagoras comes along and says, forget the elements, it's all about numbers. He believed mathematics is the key model for philosophical thought, and that everything in the universe conforms to mathematical rules and ratios.
Yeah, think about his famous theorem, it's universally true, just derived from pure reasoning. That kind of certainty was almost divine to him. He even imagined the planets moving in perfect mathematical ratios, creating this music of the spheres. It really shows how deeply he saw math structuring reality itself.
There was this early tension, too. Is everything constant, or is everything always changing? Heraclitus saw constant flux, things always passing into their opposites,
Yeah.
while Parmenides trusted reason over his senses and concluded that all is one, an unchanging reality.
These foundational questions really set the stage. And then we get to Socrates, maybe the most famous of them all, around 460 BCE. The sources really emphasize that his method, his relentless questioning of the meaning of concepts like justice, beauty, truth, it formed the basis for much of later Western philosophy.
Right. He wasn't writing books. He was having conversations, pushing people to examine their own assumptions. For him, a good life wasn't about fame or wealth, but about achieving peace of mind as a result of doing the right thing.
And the key to doing the right thing for Socrates was knowledge. He famously declared, there is only one good, knowledge, and one evil, ignorance. He saw knowledge as inextricably bound to morality. Basically, knowing what is right leads you to do what is right.
That's a powerful link, yeah, knowledge and morality. Now, his star student was Plato, and Plato's student was Aristotle. And their fundamental disagreement really shaped centuries of thought.
Absolutely. Plato, who founded the Academy, he looked around and saw the world of our senses, things changing, imperfect, here today, gone tomorrow. He thought there must be a higher realm, a world of perfect, eternal forms or ideas. Like, think of an ideal, perfect horse. You can picture it, even if you've only seen imperfect ones. These forms were, for Plato, more real than the physical things themselves, accessible through reason, not the senses. And he believed the soul was immortal and imperishable.
This is where his famous allegory of the cave comes in, right? People trapped, seeing only shadows on a wall, thinking that's reality. When the true reality, the forms, is outside, illuminated by the sun.
Then Aristotle comes along, Plato's student, and with his background in biology, he was much more grounded in observation and the senses. He founded the Lyceum and basically, turned Plato's theory on its head. He argued that those universal forms, the shared characteristics that make a horse, don't exist in some separate higher realm. They exist in the physical things themselves, right here on Earth.
So instead of looking up to a world of perfect forms, Aristotle said, look around you, study the world here and now.
Exactly. These two offer profoundly different ways of seeing reality and how we gain knowledge. This ancient period also saw philosophers thinking about how to live well beyond just Socrates' focus on knowledge. Epicurus, for instance, saw the goal of life as peace of mind, tranquility. He argued the greatest pleasure wasn't wild indulgence, but freeing yourself from fear and pain through knowledge, friendship, and temperance. He had that famously direct quote, "Death is nothing to us," basically meaning the fear of death is irrational because when death is here, we are not, and when we are here, death is not.
We also see figures like Diogenes and the Cynics advocating for a simple, ascetic life in harmony with nature. And Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, often translated as human flourishing, that's crucial. It's about living a life guided by virtue and reason, achieving your full potential as a human being. That idea echoes through later philosophy, definitely.
These ancient Greeks truly established the fundamental questions and categories that Western philosophy would grapple with for centuries to come.
And while the Greeks were laying these foundations, important philosophical ideas were also developing in Asia during this ancient period.
Absolutely. Shifting our focus to China, the emphasis was often less on the, let's say, fundamental nature of the universe, and more on practical philosophy, organizing a just society and providing moral guidelines for human interaction.
That brings us to Confucius. He focused heavily on proper conduct for one's role in society. The superior man does what is proper, and the concept of the Junzi, the noble or superior person who cultivates virtue.
Yeah, key Confucian ideas include Ren, which is often translated as benevolence or humaneness, and the belief that virtue isn't just for rulers or the elite, it's something anyone can cultivate. He saw heaven not just as a deity, maybe, but as the source of this moral order that humans should embody.
We also see Taoism emerge, often associated with Laozi, focusing on living in harmony with the Wei, or the Tao, the natural, spontaneous flow of the universe, and Mozi, who actually challenged Confucius, arguing for universal love and treating everyone equally, regardless of their station.
Meanwhile, over in India, we have the profound teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. His central realization was about suffering. He understood that suffering is universal. It is an integral part of existence.
And he identified the root cause of this suffering, not as external forces, but our own internal state, our attachments, our desires, our expectations, our craving for things to be other than they are, even our strong instinct for self-preservation, the ego.
Right. He taught that by overcoming this selfishness, this clinging to a fixed self, you could find freedom from suffering, which is the state of not self.
So look at the contrast there. In Greece, you have these debates about the physical stuff of the cosmos and the nature of knowledge. In China, it's heavily focused on social harmony and morality.
Yeah.
And in India, a deep dive into the human condition of suffering and how to transcend it. Different angles, yeah, but all asking fundamental questions about existence and how to live.
Exactly. These ancient traditions, both East and West, build this incredibly diverse groundwork for millennia of philosophical exploration.
And the medieval period then acted as a crucial bridge, reconnecting some of these ancient ideas across cultures.
Yes, particularly through the Islamic world, which preserved and translated many Greek texts, especially Aristotle, when they were largely lost in Europe. As Islam spread, these ideas were reintroduced to Europe, and Christian philosophers began the complex work of integrating them with religious doctrine.
Which led to tackling some big theological philosophical problems, like the problem of evil. Why does evil exist if God is good? St. Augustine of Hippo, influenced by Plato, argued that God is not the parent of evils. Instead, evil isn't a positive thing, but rather a lack or deficiency, like a hole in a shirt isn't a patch of nothing, but the absence of fabric. And our free will allows us to choose to turn away from the good, creating that deficiency.
Right. And Boethius grappled with divine foreknowledge. If God already knows everything we will do, are we truly free?
And the mind-body problem came up again. Avicenna, a Persian philosopher, had a view that the soul is distinct from the body, a kind of dualism that fit well with Christian ideas of an immortal soul separate from the physical body.
This view became pretty influential, and it contrasts with Aristotle's idea that mind and body are much more, intertwined. This specific debate really anticipates later heavyweights like Descartes and Aquinas.
And then St. Anselm gives us the ontological argument for God's existence. The idea that simply by thinking about the concept of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, you could deduce that God must exist, because existence in reality is greater than existence only in the mind. Just by thinking about God, we can know he exists.
A pure argument from reason. Yeah. Reconciling faith and reason was paramount back then. Averroes, an Islamic judge and famous commentator on Aristotle, argued that philosophy and religion are not incompatible. He thought they were maybe different paths to truth, sometimes associated with the idea of double truth, suggesting that philosophical truths and religious truths exist in their own contexts. He also suggested that philosophers believe that religious laws are necessary political arts, meaning they serve a social purpose, even if philosophers arrived at truth differently.
Moses Maimonides, a Jewish philosopher, tackled how we can even talk about God. He argued God has no attributes in the way we understand them, because any human attribute kind of limits God. So saying God is powerful should be understood as a double negative, like saying God is not powerless.
And this period isn't all just dry debate. You have figures like Rumi, the Sufi mystic, with beautiful poetic thought like, "Don't grieve, anything you lose comes round in another form." It reminds us that philosophical wisdom can come in many forms. The medieval period truly shows the dynamic interplay of ideas across different traditions and how ancient thought was rediscovered and, well, reinterpreted.
Fast forward then, and we arrive at the Renaissance and the Age of Reason, a time of massive upheaval and new ways of thinking.
Yeah, the Renaissance sees a shift towards humanism, placing human potential and experience at the center rather than focusing solely on God. And the scientific revolution, with figures like Copernicus and Galileo, fundamentally challenged the old order and showed the power of observation and mathematics.
And that brings us back to that ancient connection between philosophy and science, particularly math, like we saw with Pythagoras and Thales.
Exactly. And this period ignited a major debate about how we can know anything at all. Epistemology became really central. The great divide was between rationalism and empiricism.
Okay, rationalists believe true knowledge comes primarily from reason, from thinking logically. René Descartes is the icon here, trying to find something he could be absolutely certain of, even if, like you said, an evil demon was trying to deceive him. He famously concluded, "I am thinking, therefore I exist." That was his first undeniable truth.
Right. Spinoza, another rationalist, saw the universe as one single substance he called God, or nature. He believed God is the cause of all things which are in him. This one substance had attributes like extension, physicality, and thought, mentality, and everything else was just a mode of this one substance.
And Leibniz believed, in principle at least, all knowledge is accessible through rational reflection, though practically we need senses too.
But on the other side were the empiricists, who argued that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience. John Locke proposed the mind is a tabula rasa, a blank tablet at birth. There's no innate knowledge. All our ideas and knowledge are written onto it by experience.
George Berkeley took that even further, didn't he? Arguing that physical things only exist if they are perceived. A thing only exists insofar as it perceives or is perceived. For him, the world is just ideas in minds, our minds, and crucially, God's mind, which keeps things existing even when we're not looking.
And David Hume, perhaps the most radical empiricist, he essentially said any meaningful statement is either about relations of ideas, like math, which is demonstrative, or matters of fact, based on experience, which is probable. Anything else is basically meaningless. He famously highlighted the problem of induction. Just because the sun has risen every day doesn't logically prove it will rise tomorrow. Our belief in cause and effect is based on habit, not logical or empirical proof.
That's a pretty unsettling thought. The basis of science, cause and effect, questioned at its core. So you have reason on one side, experience on the other, and Hume leaves this big problem. How do you bridge that gap?
Enter Immanuel Kant. His transcendental idealism was a kind of synthesis. He agreed with Hume that we can't know things in themselves, the world independently of our minds. But he also argued our minds aren't just blank slates passively receiving data. They actively structure experience using innate a priori concepts, things like space, time, and cause and effect, that make ordered experience and therefore science possible.
Yeah, okay. So the mind provides the framework and experience provides the content. The framework, like causality, isn't in the world itself, maybe, but it's how our minds have to process the world to make sense of it.
Exactly. It's precisely in knowing its limits that philosophy exists, as Kant put it. He sort of defined the boundaries of what we can know. This era fundamentally changed the philosophical landscape, especially regarding knowledge.
And that intense focus on how we know things really set the stage for the next period, the Age of Revolution, where philosophers turned their critical eye to society, politics, and the human condition itself.
Yes, politics and power became huge themes. Niccolo Machiavelli looking at political reality rather than just ideals. He's famous for the idea, often summarized as, the end justifies the means, particularly for a ruler needing to maintain power and stability. He thought conventional morality wasn't really sufficient in the brutal world of politics.
Though it's worth noting, the sources point out he also argued for republics in other writings, suggesting his views were maybe more complex. Then we have the social contract theorist grappling with the basis of political authority.
Right. Hobbes saw a brutal state of nature without government, leading to a need for a strong sovereign, the Leviathan, to provide order in exchange for some freedoms. Locke argued for natural rights that governments must protect.
And Rousseau contrasted Hobbes, famously stating, "Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains." He believed society, particularly private property, corrupted natural human goodness and led to unjust systems. He introduced that complex idea of the general will of the people as the legitimate basis for law.
Adam Smith applied philosophical thought to economics. Seeing humans as fundamentally motivated by exchange, man is an animal that makes bargains. He argued that individual self-interest in a free market could, sort of unintentionally, benefit society as a whole, the idea often called the invisible hand.
He had that revolutionary idea that a nation's wealth comes from its labor, not just gold. Though he also noted the potential, dehumanizing effects of breaking down work into simple, repetitive tasks through the division of labor.
Then looking at the grand sweep of history, Hegel offered this vast idealistic system using the dialectic, a process of thesis, antithesis, resolving into a synthesis, to describe history as the unfolding of absolute spirit, or reason becoming fully conscious of itself. The true as a whole, he believed, meaning reality is a single, interconnected, developing thought process.
Karl Marx, deeply influenced by Hegel but kind of flipping him on his head, saw a history driven by material and economics forces, specifically class conflict between groups like the ruling bourgeoisie and the working class, the proletariat.
Marx argued that even philosophy and ideas tend to serve the interests of the ruling class. He famously envisioned a communist society based on the principle, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. His Communist Manifesto opens so powerfully, quote, "A specter is haunting Europe."
And that's a stark contrast to someone like Henry David Thoreau, who advocated for civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance against unjust laws, while Marx saw violent revolution as necessary for change.
This era also saw philosophers grapple deeply with individual meaning in what felt like a rapidly changing world. Kierkegaard is a key forerunner to existentialism, focusing on individual choice, subjectivity, and the search for meaning in the face of uncertainty. He described anxiety not just as fear, but as the dizziness of freedom, that feeling you get when you realize the terrifying scope of your choices.
Albert Camus explored this idea of meaninglessness directly. He felt life was inherently meaningless, that the universe is just silent in the face of our human need for meaning. But he argued embracing this absurdity is the key to living fully. He used the myth of Sisyphus condemned to endlessly roll a boulder uphill as an image of this. The struggle is meaningless, but acknowledging and facing it with consciousness allows for defiance and meaning in the struggle itself. As he put it, life will be lived all the better if it has no meaning.
Jean-Paul Sartre explicitly anchored existentialism in atheism. There is no God, therefore no preordained human nature or purpose. He famously coined the phrase, existence precedes essence. For a tool, like a paper knife, its essence, its purpose, is decided before it exists. But for humans, we first exist, and then we are free to create our own essence, our own purpose through our choices. This radical freedom, he argued, brings immense responsibility.
Different views on suffering also emerged. Schopenhauer saw suffering as fundamental to reality, driven by a blind cosmic will. This contrasts with the Buddha, who saw suffering as something to be overcome, and figures like Miguel de Unamuno, who felt suffering was an essential, vital part of being truly human.
Then you have pragmatism, which shifted the focus from abstract truth to the practical consequences and usefulness of ideas. Charles Sanders Peirce advised, consider what effects things have. The meaning of a concept is in its practical effects.
William James added that truth happens to an idea. Ideas aren't born true. They become true through experience and action if they work and are useful. For him, true beliefs are basically those that are useful in navigating the world.
John Dewey, influenced by Darwin's evolutionary ideas, saw humans as beings constantly adapting to a changing world. He believed philosophy should address the real, practical problems of living and be judged by its usefulness in solving them, saying, "We do not solve philosophical problems, we get over them." This focus on practical application is echoed in someone like W.E.B. Du Bois, who applied pragmatist ideas to the struggle for racial equality, linking back to Aristotle's idea of human flourishing for all.
And finally, this packed era brought powerful critiques of culture and society itself. Friedrich Nietzsche famously proclaimed, "God is dead." Not necessarily a literal statement, but an observation that traditional sources of moral and cosmic meaning were losing their power. He critiqued the Platonic and Christian idea of a real world beyond this one as life-denying, calling it philosophy's longest error, arguing it devalued this life in favor of an imaginary one. Overcoming this, he believed, was the zenith of mankind.
Bertrand Russell, looking at modern life, famously critiqued the societal attitude towards work. He argued, immense harm is caused by the belief that work is virtuous, and that a more rational, less work-obsessed society would be better for human happiness.
And Theodor Adorno, part of the Frankfurt School, offered a sharp critique of mass culture, things like TV and movies, arguing it can erode our capacity for independent thought and feeling, distorting our view of the world and making it harder to make genuine moral judgments.
Yeah.
He famously stated, intelligence is a moral category, suggesting that true moral judgment requires both critical thought and deep feeling.
Wow. This period really feels like philosophy grappling with the consequences of modernity. Industrialization, political revolutions, the loss of traditional anchors, forcing thinkers to look inward at the human condition and outward at the structures of power and society.
Which brings us to contemporary philosophy, roughly from post-WWII onwards, navigating a world of technology, global conflict, media saturation, and countercultural movements.
Yeah, a major theme in contemporary thought has been language. How does language work? How does it shape our perception of reality? Early Ludwig Wittgenstein, in his Tractatus, believed, the limits of my language are the limits of my world, arguing that language pictures reality. He thought things like ethics and mysticism were hugely important, but couldn't be said in language. They could only make themselves manifest. He famously described his book as a ladder to be climbed and then kicked away once you've reached the top.
Rudolf Carnap, a logical positivist, focused on verifying statements empirically. He felt much traditional philosophy was meaningless because its statements couldn't be verified. He saw philosophy's role as clarifying language to avoid what he saw as, well, pseudo-problems.
Willard Van Orman Quine challenged this, arguing that language is a social art. Meaning doesn't come from simple links between words and things, but from the whole structure of language used within a community. He used his gamagai example. If a linguist is trying to translate a native saying, gavagai, when a rabbit runs by, how do they know if it means rabbit, dinner, lookout, or something else entirely? It shows the indeterminacy of translation and that meaning is holistic and social.
And later, semiotics and post-structuralism pushed this even further. Roland Barthes, for example, explored how meaning is created in texts and signs, describing language not just as a tool, but like a complex skin or an encyclopedia structure, as he did in The Lover's Discourse. Jacques Derrida, with deconstruction, famously stated, there is nothing outside of the text, meaning our understanding of reality is always mediated by language and systems of signs. He explored how meaning is always deferred, unstable, and, well, contradictory.
The philosophy of science also continued the debate started by Hume and Kant, really. Thomas Kuhn argued in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions that science doesn't just progress incrementally, but through revolutionary paradigm shifts when the old framework for understanding the world breaks down and a new one takes its place.
Karl Popper, building on Hume's problem of induction, argued that science isn't about proving theories true, which you can't really do universally. It's about falsifiability, proposing bold hypotheses and then rigorously trying to prove them wrong. A scientific theory is one that could be proven wrong by evidence.
And Paul Feyerabend, more controversially perhaps, argued against any single universal method for science, suggesting that historically successful science has followed no fixed rules. His motto was essentially, anything goes.
Understanding power has also been a dominant theme. Michel Foucault analyzed how power operates not just top-down, but in subtle ways through institutions and discourses. He studied the genealogy of ideas around things like madness, clinics, or prisons, showing how concepts we think are natural have historical origins and function as systems of control. He argued concepts like man or human nature aren't eternal truths, but recent inventions, like a face drawn in the sand that could be washed away.
Noam Chomsky offers sharp critiques of political power, often analyzing how governments use language and manipulate information, suggesting we need to demand evidence for political claims. His work, including ideas explored in manufacturing consent, examines how mass media can serve the interests of powerful elites.
Jürgen Habermas proposed communicative reason, the idea that our rationality is rooted in our ability to justify our claims to others in open communication. He highlighted the importance of the public sphere, historical spaces like coffee houses or salons where citizens could engage in reasoned debate, acting as a vital buffer between private life and state power. As he puts it, society is dependent upon a criticism of its own traditions.
Jean-François Lyotard noted how, in postmodern society, knowledge is increasingly treated as a commodity, valued not for its truth but its usefulness and efficiency, raising concerns about who controls access to and the definition of valuable knowledge.
The human condition, ethics, and identity remain central too. Existentialism continued with Sartre, as we mentioned, emphasizing freedom and responsibility. Merleau-Ponty, a phenomenologist in works like Phenomenology of Perception, rejected mind-body dualism, arguing for the body subject, that our consciousness is fundamentally embodied, our understanding of the world comes through our physical existence. And Emmanuel Levinas focused on ethics as the first philosophy, arguing our fundamental ethical obligation comes from encountering the face of the other person, particularly the stranger or the vulnerable, like a beggar.
The sources also touched on the philosophy of love, with Walter Benjamin suggesting the only way of knowing a person is to love them without hope, implying a total acceptance beyond expectation. And Max Scheler seeing love not just as an emotion, but a way of knowing, bridging gaps in understanding.
And crucial discussions about identity and difference emerged, particularly around gender and race. Simone de Beauvoir, in The Second Sex, noted how historically man is defined as a human being and woman as a female, arguing the male has been the default standard against which women are defined as other.
Yeah, and feminism further explored these ideas. Thinkers like Luce Irigaray, who believed every desire has a relation to madness and explored adopting and subverting feminine roles. Helene Cixous, with her idea of écriture feminine, a distinct feminine way of writing. And Julia Kristeva, who critiqued women simply adopting male traits and worked to break down traditional male-female binaries. Frantz Fanon explored the psychological impact of colonialism and racial inferiority, how colonized people internalize white standards, and the fundamental demand for recognition as fully human beings.
Contemporary ethics also gives us important contributions, like Adorno's point about the need for both intelligence and feeling for true moral judgment, or Peter Singer's work on animal liberation, challenging speciesism, the prejudice based on species, and arguing that animal suffering matters and the interests of animals count in our ethical considerations, drawing on utilitarian ideas.
And importantly, the sources remind us that philosophy isn't just a Western tradition. Figures like Henry Odera Aruka in Kenya documented sage philosophy, exploring philosophical thinking within African oral traditions, identifying philosophical sagacity in wise individuals. And Hajime Tanabe in Japan synthesized Japanese traditions with European philosophy, grappling with concepts like confession and repentance, connecting back to figures like Socrates, interestingly enough.
Wow. That really is an incredible sweep of human thought across millennia and continents. It makes you realize these aren't just dusty ideas. They're the foundations of how we think about everything from reality and knowledge to justice and meaning.
Absolutely. When you see it laid out like this, you see the recurring themes. What is real? How can we be sure of anything? What does it mean to live well, individually and collectively? How do our tools, like language and science, shape our understanding?
And you can clearly see how these ideas build on, challenge, or react against each other across time. Plato's forms echo in Augustine and Avicenna. Aristotle's focus on the earthly influences Aquinas, and later even Darwin influenced pragmatists like Dewey and Dubois. Hume's skepticism about induction leads directly to Popper's idea of falsifiability. The social contract ideas influence modern political philosophy like Rawls. Hegel's grand system inspires Marx. Kierkegaard's focus on individual choice prefigures the existentialists. Saussure's linguistics are key to Barthes and Derrida. It's this constant dynamic conversation.
It's like watching a multi-thousand-year-old debate unfold, with each generation adding their voice and grappling with the answers provided by the last.
And that's why exploring these different perspectives is so valuable for you, our listener. It gives you a framework for understanding the world, the assumptions behind different ideas you encounter, and perhaps even clarifies some of your own deepest questions. It truly is about extracting those essential nuggets to become more well-informed, not just about philosophy, but about the human experience itself.
It shows that the search for understanding is just as important as finding any definitive answers, maybe even more so.
Absolutely. Philosophy is the practice of that search.
It continues, yeah.
And on that note, as we wrap up this deep dive into this magnificent stack of philosophical thought, here is a final provocative thought for you to consider. Given the vast diversity of ideas we've explored today, and the often conflicting ways thinkers have approached fundamental questions like, what is knowledge? Or what does it mean to live well? How do you personally navigate this landscape? What criteria do you use to decide which ideas are most useful, compelling, or resonant in your own life?
Something to ponder long after the deep dive ends.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you for joining us for this exploration of ideas.
It's a conversation worth having.